It had been hours since I'd seen another car on the highway, and the rain was only getting worse. My eyes burned from staring at the road, trying to make out the lines through the blur of water on the windshield. The wipers were working overtime, but it barely made a difference. The storm was relentless, like it had been chasing me all night. I finally spotted the gas station sign, one of those old neon ones that flicker like they're on their last legs. I couldn't even read the name of the place, just the glow cutting through the dark. I didn't care. I was tired, hungry, and I needed a break. I pulled in, tires splashing through the puddles, and parked under the awning. The engine hummed for a few seconds before I killed it, leaving only the sound of rain drumming on the roof. I sat there for a moment, staring through the windshield at the dim lights of the station, hoping it wasn't completely abandoned. When I stepped out, the cold hit me first. The air was thick with rain, and the wind whipped through my jacket like it wasn't even there. I pulled my hood up, squinting against the downpour, and jogged toward the station doors. They slid open with a sluggish hiss, but the place was dead. No clerk, no music, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint rattle of the wind against the windows. I looked around. Shelves were half empty, and the ones that weren't looked like they hadn't been restocked in months. Chips, old candy, a few cans of something unrecognizable. There was a coffee machine in the corner, but the pot looked like it had been sitting there for days, thick and cold. I rubbed the back of my neck, the silence starting to settle in. The whole place felt off. You know that feeling when you're alone, but you start second-guessing it? Like maybe you're not? I couldn't shake it. I went to the counter and tapped the bell, waiting for a clerk to show up from the back. No one came. I tried again. Nothing. That's when I noticed the security cameras above me. One of them was pointed right at the door, red light blinking, but there was no one watching the feed. Or at least, no one I could see. I leaned on the counter, glancing around the empty store, my nerves on edge. The rain pounding outside just made the silence inside worse, like the world had shrunk down to this one little spot in the middle of nowhere. Something about it just wasn't right. Then, from the corner of my eye, I spotted a car. It was parked off to the side of the lot, barely visible through the sheets of rain. The windows were fogged up, but there was a shape, something moving inside. I squinted, trying to make it out. That's when I saw her. I was halfway through filling the tank when I saw it. Parked at the far end of the lot, just outside the reach of the gas station lights, was an old, beat-up sedan. It looked like it had been sitting there a while. The windows were completely fogged up, but something inside moved, just for a split second, but enough to catch my attention. At first, I figured someone was probably just waiting out the storm or sleeping it off. But as I glanced over again, something felt off. Before I could think too much about it, the car door creaked open, and this woman stumbled out. She looked like she'd been through hell. Her clothes were torn, hair matted down from the rain, and her face. There was something in her expression that sent a chill down my spine. Fear. Pure, raw fear. She walked toward me, but it was more like she was staggering, her legs barely able to carry her. And as she got closer, I could see her hands shaking. I stopped pumping gas, trying to figure out what the hell was going on, but before I could say anything, she spoke. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely louder than the rain pounding down around us. "You have to help me. He's coming back." I stared at her, not sure how to react. "What do you mean? Who's coming back?" My voice sounded calm, but inside, alarm bells were ringing. She didn't answer me directly. Instead, her eyes darted toward the road, then back to me, like she was trapped in some kind of nightmare. "Please, hide me. I don't have much time." Her voice cracked as if she was barely holding it together. I was still trying to make sense of it all when, out of the corner of my eye, I caught the glow of approaching headlights in the distance. Instantly, her panic spiked. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my jacket, pulling me closer, almost like she was trying to disappear behind me. The headlights were getting brighter, cutting through the sheets of rain as they drew nearer. My gut told me this wasn't just some messed up misunderstanding. Whoever was in that car, they were bad news. "Hide me," she repeated, her voice shaking even more now. I could see her desperation, feel it. I didn't know what I was about to get involved in, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was coming down that road wasn't good. The rain wasn't letting up, and the headlights kept getting closer, slicing through the darkness like knives. My heart was pounding as the woman clung to my arm, her nails digging into my skin. I couldn't just stand there. I didn't know what was going on, but everything about this felt wrong. I glanced back toward the road just in time to see the car pull into the lot. It wasn't some casual driver caught in the storm. This was a rusted old pickup truck, moving slowly like it was hunting something. Or someone. The woman squeezed my arm tighter, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "That's him," she whispered, barely audible over the rain. "Please, don't let him find me." I felt the weight of the situation hit me hard. Whoever this guy was, he was here for her. And the look on her face told me everything I needed to know. I couldn't let him near her. The truck rolled to a stop a few yards away, its engine idling loud in the rain. The driver's door creaked open, and a man stepped out. Big guy, taller than me, built like he could break someone in half if he wanted to. His face was mostly hidden under the brim of a soaked baseball cap, but I could still make out his eyes. Cold, dead. Like he didn't care about the rain or the fact that I was standing there. All he cared about was finding her. He walked toward me, slow and deliberate, scanning the area like he owned it. My stomach tightened as he got closer, his boots splashing through puddles with each step. "You seen a woman around here?" His voice was low, gravelly, like he didn't expect me to say no. He wasn't asking me, he was telling me to answer. I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. "Haven't seen anyone," I lied, praying he couldn't see the woman huddled just behind me, barely out of sight. His eyes locked on mine, and for a second, I thought he knew. He stood there, sizing me up, his hand resting on the hood of my truck like he was daring me to slip up. The rain pounded down around us, making everything feel tense, suffocating. "You sure about that?" he asked, taking a step closer. His tone was sharp now, more aggressive. He wasn't buying it. I held my ground, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "Yeah, sure." He stared at me for what felt like an eternity, the rain dripping off his hat. Then, without a word, he turned and started pacing around the lot, scanning the area like he was expecting her to pop out at any second. I could feel the woman trembling behind me, and I knew we didn't have long. If he got too close, if he checked my truck, it'd all be over. The guy kept prowling around, circling the gas station lot like a wolf on the hunt. Every few seconds, I'd glance over my shoulder, checking on the woman huddled low in the passenger seat of my truck, hoping she'd stay hidden. She hadn't said a word since I told the guy I hadn't seen anyone, and I could feel the weight of her fear pressing down on me like a vice. I watched as he moved toward the sedan parked at the far end of the lot. He leaned in, peering through the fogged-up windows, his frustration growing. His fingers drummed on the roof of the car, then he kicked the side of it, the thud echoing across the empty station. That sound made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. This guy wasn't just looking for her, he was angry, like someone who didn't care what kind of damage he had to do to get what he wanted. Rain poured off the brim of his hat as he made his way back toward me. My hands were sweating, but I forced myself to stay calm, keeping my eyes on him as he approached again. He stopped right in front of me, this time closer than before. I could see his face clearly now, rough, with deep lines like a guy who's been through hell and didn't care anymore. He tilted his head, looking me up and down, and I knew he wasn't convinced. "You sure you're alone out here?" he asked, his voice a low growl. His eyes darted to my truck, scanning it for any sign of the woman. Funny place for a trucker to stop this long. I swallowed hard, feeling the tension coil in my gut. Just filling up, waiting for the rain to let up before heading back on the road. He lingered for a moment, just staring, like he was trying to decide whether to call me out or move on. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it, but I didn't budge. I just stood there, trying to look as casual as possible, praying he'd give up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he turned back toward his truck. I could hear the crunch of his boots as he stomped through the gravel, each step slower than the last, like he was giving me one last chance to crack. But I didn't. The engine of his rusted pickup roared to life, and the headlights lit up the rain-drenched parking lot as he pulled out, tires spinning in the mud. I watched as his taillights disappeared down the road, fading into the darkness. The relief hit me like a wave, and I let out a long, shaky breath. I walked back to the truck and opened the door. The woman was still there, curled up in the seat, shaking. She looked up at me, her face pale and her eyes wide. "He's gone," I said, trying to sound calm, though my heart was still racing. "You're safe now." She nodded, but her hands were trembling, gripping her knees like she was still bracing for him to come back. "We gotta get out of here," I muttered, starting the engine, the low rumble breaking the eerie quiet that had settled over the gas station. Without another word, I pulled out onto the highway, the storm still raging around us as we headed down the dark, empty road. In the rearview mirror, I could still see her face, pale and haunted, her eyes darting to the road behind us. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she didn't believe he was really gone. Neither did I. The rain had eased up by the time we hit the next stretch of highway, but the tension in the cab was still thick. The woman stayed quiet, staring straight ahead, her hands gripping the edge of the seat like she was bracing for impact. I kept glancing at her in the rear view, trying to figure out what to say, but nothing felt right. I didn't even know what I'd gotten myself into. The miles ticked by in silence. Every once in a while, I'd check the road behind us, half expecting to see those damn headlights coming back. But it was just the darkness swallowing us up as we drove. Finally, after what felt like hours, the woman spoke. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. "This is far enough." I blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean? We're in the middle of nowhere." She didn't answer right away. She just sat there, eyes still locked on the road ahead. Then, with a calmness that didn't match the fear I'd seen in her earlier, she turned to me. "He won't find me now." Her words sent a chill down my spine. There was something off in the way she said it, too certain, too final. I pulled the truck over to the side of the road, the tires crunching on the wet gravel. The storm had mostly passed, leaving the air damp and heavy. "You sure this is where you want to get out?" I asked, though I already knew her answer. She nodded, opening the door before I could say anything else. The cold night air rushed in, and I watched as she stepped out onto the dark, empty road. "Look," I started, not even sure what I was going to say. Do you need me to call someone? I can get you to a safer spot at least." But she didn't respond. She just stood there, looking down the road like she was seeing something I couldn't. Then she turned back to me, and for the first time she smiled. But it wasn't a smile of relief or gratitude. It was something else, something I couldn't quite place. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but firm, "for everything." Before I could respond, she turned and started walking. Just like that. No hesitation, no looking back. I watched her disappear into the shadows, her figure swallowed by the night. I waited there for a minute, maybe longer, just staring at the spot where she'd vanished. Something about the whole thing didn't sit right with me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Finally, with a heavy sigh, I put the truck back in gear and pulled away from the side of the road. As I drove off, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see her standing there. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching out behind me. It wasn't until a few miles later that the reality hit me. I'd never asked her name. I've spent years in these woods, but that evening, something felt different. It had been a long day, successful enough. My rifle was slung over my shoulder, the weight of the game I'd caught pulling at my back, and the sky had taken on that deep orange hue as twilight settled in. The crunch of leaves beneath my boots echoed in the still air, the sound usually comforting, a reminder that I was alone with the wilderness. But tonight, that stillness felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, it was subtle, like the occasional rustle of leaves that might have been the wind, or the snap of a twig in the distance that could have been any animal moving through the brush. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as nerves. After all, it wasn't the first time the woods had played tricks on me as night crept in. But the feeling grew, gnawing at me. My steps quickened, the familiar path suddenly seeming endless. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see nothing but the trees standing sentinel behind me. Two figures, barely visible in the fading light, were standing among the trees. At first I thought it might just be shadows playing tricks on me, but they were too solid, too real. One of them, a tall, thin man, moved in a way that immediately set my teeth on edge. His gait was jerky, unnatural, like he wasn't used to walking. And then there was the other one. It wasn't a person. Not even close. It moved on four legs, but it was too big to be anything I knew. The way it slithered between the trees was unsettling, like it belonged in the woods, like it was part of them. Its eyes gleamed unnaturally, catching what little light was left in the sky and staring directly at me. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back, forcing myself not to break into a run. I quickened my pace, adrenaline coursing through me, but no matter how fast I moved, the feeling of being followed wouldn't leave me. I could hear them now, not in a way I could pinpoint, but I knew they were there, gaining on me. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew better. I tried to stay calm, but the faster I walked, the heavier that feeling grew. The sensation that someone or something was right behind me. My instincts were screaming at me to keep moving, but I couldn't help it. I had to look. I stopped and turned around. There they were again. The two figures, no longer just shadows in the distance, but clear, dark shapes against the dimming forest. The tall man moved closer now, still with that odd mechanical gait. His head was cocked slightly to one side, and though the light was fading, I could tell something was off about him. He didn't move like a normal person, more like a puppet, his limbs stiff and jerky, like each step was forced. But it was the other figure that truly made my blood run cold. At first glance, it looked like some kind of animal, but no animal I'd ever seen in all my years out here. Its body was too large, unnaturally large, and it moved with a grace that was almost fluid. It glided between the trees as if it were part of the forest itself, completely silent, despite its size. And its eyes, those eyes were glowing, not reflecting the fading light like a deer's might, but glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. I felt my stomach knot up. This wasn't right. Nothing about this was right. I took a step back, my grip tightening on my rifle. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no logic here. The man, if he even was a man, moved toward me at a slow, deliberate pace. Meanwhile, the creature slunk through the trees with alarming speed, as if it were stalking me, waiting for the right moment to strike. They were getting closer, and I knew I couldn't outrun them. My heart hammered in my chest as panic set in. I had no choice but to act. Without thinking, I raised my rifle and aimed directly at the creature. I didn't have time to think. My instincts took over as I aimed the rifle, my pulse pounding in my ears. The creature moved too fast, its dark, unnatural form weaving between the trees with an eerie silence. I steadied my hands, ignoring the dread creeping up my spine. I pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the forest, a deafening crack that shattered the silence. The creature let out a shriek, a sound that didn't belong in this world. It was high-pitched, almost human, but with a primal edge that chilled me to my core. The thing stumbled, collapsing into the brush, thrashing in the leaves as the sound of its dying screech faded into an eerie quiet. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel relief. I'd hit it. Whatever that thing was, it was down. But then, I realized the man was still there. I turned my focus back to him, expecting him to flee after the creature fell, but he didn't move. He just stood there, at the edge of the clearing, his dark silhouette motionless, staring at me. Even from this distance, I could feel his gaze, cold, unblinking, fixed directly on me. It was unnerving, more so than the creature I'd just shot. There was something wrong with him. His stillness felt unnatural, almost as if he wasn't even breathing. I kept the rifle raised, my finger hovering over the trigger, but he didn't flinch. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in that moment. Then, without a word or sound, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the thick woods as if he'd never been there at all. I lowered the rifle, my hands shaking. My breath came in ragged gasps as the adrenaline coursed through me, my body still locked in fight or flight mode. I had no idea what I'd just seen, or what I'd just killed. But whatever it was, I needed to know. I approached the spot where the creature had fallen, every instinct telling me to turn back, to leave this place and forget any of this ever happened. But I couldn't shake the need to see it, to understand what I'd just shot. When I reached the spot, my heart dropped. The creature was gone. No blood, no body, no sign that anything had been there at all. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. My stomach twisted as I stared at the empty patch of ground where the creature should have been. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. It didn't make any sense. There was no blood, no tracks, no broken branches or disturbed earth. Just nothing. I knelt down, running my hand through the damp leaves, expecting to feel some sign that it had been real. But the forest floor was undisturbed, as if the creature had never been there at all. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what had just happened. I'd heard the shot, seen the thing collapse. It wasn't my imagination. It couldn't be. I stood up, scanning the trees around me, half expecting to see the man lurking in the shadows again. But the woods were still. Too still. The kind of silence that pressed in on you, suffocating and unnatural. I felt exposed, like the eyes I thought were gone hadn't left me at all. I backed away from the spot, my rifle now heavy in my hands. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out, to leave these woods behind. But my legs felt rooted to the ground. My brain stuck replaying the last few minutes over and over. I thought about the man, the way he stood there, completely unfazed by what had happened. How he'd simply turned and vanished into the trees, as if he was part of the forest itself. Nothing about it felt human. And then the creature, what was it? My breathing was shallow as I tried to calm myself, but the dread was creeping deeper, settling into my bones. I wasn't dealing with anything I could explain, anything I could hunt. I was out of my element, and the realization hit me hard. Whatever had just happened wasn't over. The forest felt alive now, watching me, waiting for something. And that thing, whatever it was, I had a sinking feeling it hadn't really gone anywhere. I turned, forcing myself to walk, but the unease followed me. I picked up my pace, my eyes scanning the darkening woods as I hurried through the trees, trying to shake the feeling that no matter how fast I moved, I wasn't alone. And that creature, the one I'd shot, it hadn't vanished. It was still out there. I moved as fast as I could, my boots crunching through the underbrush. But no matter how far I got, that feeling clung to me, like the forest was alive, like it was following me. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind felt like a threat. I couldn't shake the idea that something was still watching, tracking me as I made my way back. My breathing was heavy now, adrenaline still pumping, but the deeper I went into the woods, the more everything started to look the same. Familiar paths seemed distorted, as if the forest itself had changed, twisting and shifting to trap me inside. The trees seemed denser, darker, their branches arching over me like claws. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the man again, his tall, thin frame moving stiffly through the trees, or worse, that creature, emerging from the shadows like it had never left. But there was nothing, just that suffocating silence and the feeling of eyes on my back. The cabin lights from my property finally came into view, a distant flicker through the trees. I felt a surge of relief, but it was fleeting. I couldn't shake the sense that I hadn't left anything behind, that whatever I had encountered in those woods hadn't stayed there. I slowed down as I approached the cabin, gripping my rifle tight, my eyes darting to every shadow. I stopped just before the clearing, my heart pounding as I scanned the tree line one last time. There was no sign of the man, no sign of the creature, but that didn't mean I was safe. I crossed the clearing quickly, reaching the door with trembling hands. As I stepped inside, the warmth of the cabin felt foreign, like it didn't belong to me anymore. I locked the door behind me, leaning against it for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, to convince myself it was over. But the silence inside wasn't comforting. It was thick, heavy, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting. I tossed my rifle onto the table, my eyes still fixed on the window. Outside, the forest loomed, dark and endless. I could almost feel it watching me, pressing in closer, the same way it had when I'd spotted those figures for the first time. I wasn't sure if I had truly escaped or if I'd brought something back with me, but one thing was certain, I wouldn't be sleeping tonight. It was one of those nights where the road seemed to stretch on forever, and the rain just wouldn't let up. The kind of rain that blurs everything outside your windshield, and no matter how fast your wipers go, it's like you're driving through a waterfall. I'd been on the highway for hours, just me and the hum of the engine, with the occasional flash of lightning breaking up the darkness. The GPS showed nothing ahead but empty road and a small town miles away, though it felt like I'd never reach it. I was starting to get that heavy feeling behind my eyes, the kind where you know you should pull over and rest, but you don't because there's nowhere to stop. No gas stations, no diners, not even another car on the road. Just mile after mile of pitch-black asphalt cutting through the night. The only sound was the rain pounding on the roof, relentless, like it wasn't going to stop anytime soon. Every so often, I'd lean forward in my seat, peering through the windshield, hoping to see some sign of civilization, a rest stop, or even one of those motels that pop up out of nowhere in the middle of nowhere. But nothing. Just more rain and the occasional flash of lightning, illuminating the wet, empty highway ahead for a second before it all disappeared back into darkness. Then, through the sheets of rain, something caught my eye. A faint, blinking light up ahead, barely visible at first. I squinted through the windshield and slowed down a little. As I got closer, I realized it was a car pulled off to the side of the road, its hazard lights flickering weakly like they were struggling to stay on. It looked old, beat up, like it had been there for a while. For a second, I figured it was just abandoned, maybe a broken-down car someone had left behind. But then I saw her, a woman, standing next to the car, drenched from head to toe, waving at me like her life depended on it. She looked desperate, soaked through to the bone, her hair sticking to her face, and something about the way she was standing out there in the storm didn't sit right with me. I slowed down and pulled over to the shoulder, right in front of the old car. The rain was still coming down hard, making it tough to see clearly, but I could make out the woman rushing toward me, arms waving, almost frantic. My hand hovered over the door handle for a second, a little hesitation creeping in. Middle of nowhere, stormy night, and now this. Something about the whole situation felt off. But what was I going to do? Just drive away and leave her there? I rolled down the window a crack, just enough to hear her over the rain. She was already at the window, soaked through and breathing hard, like she'd been out in the storm for hours. "Please," she said, her voice shaky, barely above a whisper. "My car broke down. I don't have any cell service. Can you give me a ride to the next town? It's not far." I glanced back at her car, a rusted, beat-up old thing, headlights dim, barely hanging on. Her hazard lights flickered weakly, almost as if they were about to give out too. There was something strange about her. Her clothes looked old-fashioned, out of place, like she stepped out of another decade. She had this distant look in her eyes too, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. I didn't know what to say, but I couldn't just leave her out there. "All right," I finally said. "Hop in." She wasted no time, pulling open the door and sliding into the passenger seat, soaking my seat with rainwater. As soon as she got in, she just stared straight ahead, not saying a word. I tried to make some small talk, break the tension. "So, what happened with your car?" She didn't answer right away, just kept staring out at the road ahead, the rain pounding against the windshield. Finally, she muttered, "It just died, won't start." I nodded, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. The air in the car felt thick, uncomfortable, and something about her silence felt heavy. I wasn't sure what I'd just gotten myself into, but there was no turning back now. I put the car in gear and pulled back onto the highway, the rain still coming down in sheets. The road stretched ahead, but something told me this wasn't going to be a normal ride. The storm wasn't letting up, and neither was that weird feeling creeping up the back of my neck. I tried again. "Where's the next town? How far is it?" She didn't even look at me, just kept staring out the window. "Not far," she whispered. As we drove on, the rain seemed to get worse. It was coming down so hard that my wipers couldn't keep up, making the road ahead a blurry mess. I had to lean forward just to see the faint lines of the highway through the storm. It was like the road had no end, just stretching into the black, like we were the only ones out here. The woman hadn't said a word since she told me the town wasn't far. She just sat there, dripping water onto the seat, staring blankly out the window. I glanced over at her a few times, trying to shake off this gnawing feeling in my gut. Her clothes were still bugging me. They were soaked, sure, but it wasn't just that. They looked old, like something you'd find in a thrift store from decades ago. And her face, it was pale, almost too pale, like she hadn't seen sunlight in a long time. So, I cleared my throat, trying to cut through the silence. How long were you out there? Nothing. No answer. Just the sound of the rain hammering against the roof and the soft hum of the engine. I tried again, louder this time. You okay? You've been real quiet. Finally, she turned her head slightly, but not enough to really face me. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I'll be okay, just keep driving. It wasn't much of an answer, and the way she said it sent a chill up my spine. Something about her felt wrong. My hand gripped the steering wheel tighter, and I pressed my foot a little harder on the gas. I just wanted to get to this town, drop her off, and be on my way. But the miles kept passing, and there was no sign of any town. No lights in the distance, no exit signs. Just more rain, more darkness, and that empty highway stretching ahead like it went on forever. I checked the clock on the dash. We'd been driving for at least 15 minutes, maybe more, and nothing. It was like we were stuck in place, going nowhere. I glanced over at her again. You sure this town isn't far? It's been a while, and I haven't seen anything. Her response was immediate, flat. It's close. Just keep driving. I didn't like the way she said that. Something about her tone made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I stared out into the rain, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The headlights barely pierced through the downpour, and everything outside the car was a blur. That's when I noticed something strange. The temperature inside the car had dropped, significantly. It wasn't just the rain or the cold air outside. It felt like the inside of the car was getting colder, like someone had cranked the AC, except it wasn't on. I could see my breath starting to fog up the windshield. I was about to say something when, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something even weirder. Her reflection in the window, it wasn't right. The angle was off. Like the way she was sitting didn't match up with her reflection. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but enough to make my heart start racing. I forced myself to focus on the road, fighting the urge to look at her again. Something was very, very wrong here, and I was beginning to think I'd made a terrible mistake picking her up. After what felt like an eternity of driving, the road still stretched on endlessly. No sign of the town she'd mentioned. My nerves were shot, and I was starting to question everything. How long had we been driving? How far was this place? The rain pounded harder against the car, almost as if it was trying to keep us from getting wherever we were headed. I glanced at the woman again, but this time, I froze. Her seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a stop in the middle of the deserted highway. My heart was racing. I whipped my head around, scanning the back seat, the passenger side. She wasn't there. The passenger door hadn't opened, the seatbelt was still fastened, but she was just gone. I couldn't make sense of it. 1 second she was sitting there, staring out the window, and now, nothing. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I leaned over, looking down under the seat, thinking maybe she had, fallen? Crawled to the floor? My mind was scrambling for any kind of explanation, but nothing made sense. The silence in the car was deafening. The rain still beat against the roof. The wipers kept their slow, steady rhythm, but everything else felt still, empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still there, even if I couldn't see her. My pulse pounded in my ears as I reached for the passenger door, pushing it open to the sound of the rain hitting the pavement outside. I stepped out, looking down the road behind me. Maybe she'd somehow slipped out. Maybe I hadn't noticed in my exhaustion and paranoia. But there was no one. Not a single set of footprints. The rain was coming down too hard to even leave a trace. But still, I stood there for a long moment, drenched and bewildered, trying to piece together what just happened. I called out into the storm, "Hey, where are you?" My voice echoed back at me, swallowed by the downpour. But deep down, I knew she was gone, vanished without a trace. After standing in the rain for what felt like an eternity, I gave up. I climbed back into the car, drenched and shaking, but my mind couldn't let go of what had just happened. The woman had simply disappeared. No sound, no trace, just gone. The road ahead was as dark and empty as ever. but something was pulling me back to the spot where I'd first seen her. I turned the car around, the tires splashing through the rain-soaked pavement, and headed back. I had to know what the hell was going on. My headlights barely cut through the downpour as I retraced my steps, eyes scanning the side of the road for any sign of the broken-down car. The minutes stretched on, the tension in my chest growing tighter with every passing mile. Finally, I reached the spot where I'd picked her up, but instead of an old sedan with flickering hazard lights, there was nothing. No car, no signs of a breakdown, just an overgrown patch of grass, wild and unkempt like no one had been there in years. Except there was something. A small, crumbling roadside memorial, a weathered cross stuck in the ground, with a faded photograph hanging from it. My stomach turned as I stepped closer, the rain drenching the picture and the wilted flowers scattered around it. The photo was of a woman, the same woman I'd picked up just hours earlier. I froze. The photo, the look in her eyes, it was her. The same terrified face that had climbed into my car. My heart raced as I knelt down, wiping the rain from the picture, my mind trying to piece it together. Next to the cross was a small note, barely legible through the wear and tear of the weather, but I could make out a name and a date. She died here, years ago. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't possible. I'd seen her, talked to her, drove with her. But there it was, right in front of me, proof that the woman who had climbed into my car was long dead. I stood there, drenched and shaking, staring at the memorial as the reality of it all sank in. The woman who needed a ride, the woman I'd tried to help, wasn't even alive. I backed away, my head spinning, stumbling toward the car. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing: I needed to get the hell out of there. So, we finally made it to the campsite after what felt like forever on the road. It was just me, Jake, and a couple of friends, Mike and Sarah. We were all pumped for a weekend of camping, fishing, and just hanging out by the lake. I remember rolling down the windows as we drove in, feeling that fresh air hit my face. It was a welcome change from the city's chaos. The place was pretty remote, just what we wanted. Tall trees surrounded us, and the lake looked calm and inviting. We picked a spot near the water and started setting up our tents. Honestly, it felt great to be away from everything, just out here in nature. After we got everything settled, we spent the day fishing and joking around. Mike caught the biggest fish. He was practically strutting around like a peacock. As the sun started to dip, we built a fire and roasted marshmallows, sharing stories and laughing like we were kids again. But as night fell, the vibe changed a bit. It got really quiet, almost too quiet. You know that feeling when the world seems to hold its breath? I shrugged it off at first, but I noticed everyone else seemed a bit on edge too. We joked about it, but the stillness hung in the air. Later that night, I crawled into my sleeping bag, thinking about how awesome the trip was so far. But then, around midnight, I woke up to this weird noise outside my tent. At first I thought it was just a deer or something, but the sounds kept getting closer. Branches were snapping and my heart started racing. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was nothing, but deep down, I felt uneasy. I looked outside the tent and everything seemed normal, but I had the strange feeling that something was wrong. But it was only the first night, right? What could possibly go wrong? As I tried to go back to sleep, the sounds outside got louder, and that's when I realized whatever was out there wasn't just an animal. The next morning, I woke up groggy but eager to shake off the weird vibes from the night before. We all gathered around the campfire for breakfast, joking about Mike's fish and planning the day ahead. But I couldn't shake that feeling of unease. As we ate, I noticed everyone seemed a bit quieter than usual. I tried to bring it up casually, asking if anyone heard the noises last night. Mike laughed it off, saying it was probably just the wind or some raccoons looking for scraps. Sarah chimed in, saying she thought she heard something too, but dismissed it. We all joked about being scaredy cats, but I could see the flicker of concern in their eyes. After breakfast, we decided to explore the area a bit. The forest was thick and beautiful, and we hiked along a narrow path, laughing and taking pictures. But as we wandered deeper into the woods, I couldn't help but feel like something was watching us. I'd glance over my shoulder often, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking behind the trees. Later that afternoon, we returned to the campsite to chill by the lake. We started talking about the weird sounds from last night again, trying to rationalize it. Just as we were getting into it, a chill breeze swept through, and the atmosphere felt heavy. I could see the change in everyone's demeanor. It was like the forest itself had ears. As night fell, we lit up the fire and settled in for another round of stories. But every time a twig snapped in the distance, I felt a jolt of adrenaline. I noticed Jake looking around, his brow furrowed, and I knew he felt it too. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, and the air was filled with an eerie stillness. Eventually, we decided to turn in early, hoping to shake off the weirdness. As I crawled into my tent, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again, those faint sounds outside, like something was moving around our campsite. This time it wasn't just branches, there were whispers mixed in, barely audible but definitely there. My heart raced. I lay still, straining to hear more, but it was like the forest had swallowed the noises whole. I felt trapped, knowing I had to confront whatever was out there, but a part of me wanted to stay buried under my sleeping bag. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I tossed and turned, every creak of the tent sending my heart into overdrive. Just when I thought I might finally drift off, I heard it again. The whispers. They were soft at first, like a breeze rustling through the leaves, but they gradually grew louder, more insistent. I sat in my sleeping bag, struggling to make sense of the words. It felt like they were calling my name, coming in and out of the wind, freezing my bones. I spent a few minutes thinking about whether to stay in the tent and try to sleep, or go out and see what was making that noise. I decided I couldn't stay cooped up any longer. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, the cool night air hitting me like a wave. The campfire had burned low, casting flickering shadows on the trees. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing just outside the light, but the campsite was empty. The whispers, however, were still there, weaving through the trees. I walked a few steps towards the lake, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was making those sounds. As I got closer, the whispers intensified. It was almost like a conversation, but I couldn't make out any distinct words. Just fragments, my name maybe, and something that felt like a warning. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of movement at the tree line. I squinted into the darkness, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure dart between the trees. My heart raced, and I took a step back, glancing over my shoulder to make sure my friends were still asleep. "Guys, wake up!" I called softly, trying not to alarm them too much, but they didn't stir. I felt a wave of frustration mixed with fear. I needed them to see this, to hear the whispers too. I turned back to the trees, but whatever I'd seen was gone. The whispers faded, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the night settle around me, the stillness pressing in. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Feeling uneasy, I finally made my way back to the tent, deciding I'd try to shake it off. But as I lay down, staring at the fabric above me, I couldn't help but think about what I had just experienced. Something was definitely out there, and whatever it was, it felt more than just a figment of my imagination. The next morning, I woke up pensive and uneasy, the whispers from the night still fresh in my mind. I stepped out of the tent, hoping the sunlight would chase away the lingering dread. The others were already up, joking and laughing as they prepared breakfast. I wanted to join in, but the fear hung around me like a shadow. As we sat by the fire, I decided to bring up the whispers. "Did anyone hear anything weird last night?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Jake looked at me, a frown forming on his face. "Weird how?" "I don't know, just voices, maybe." I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to sound crazy. Avery chimed in. "I thought I heard something too. It was like someone was trying to talk to us." A chill ran down my spine as I realized I wasn't alone in this. We exchanged uneasy glances, but quickly brushed it off, attributing it to our imaginations running wild in the woods. Later that afternoon, we decided to go for a swim in the lake to shake off the eerie vibe. The water was refreshing, but the strange atmosphere clung to us. After swimming, we lounged on the shore, the laughter temporarily dispelling our fears. But as evening approached, I felt that familiar weight in my chest. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows began to stretch and twist in the trees. That's when I saw it, a dark figure standing at the edge of the forest, barely visible through the branches. "Guys, look," I pointed, my voice trembling. They turned, but by the time they did, the figure had vanished. "What are you talking about?" Jake asked, squinting into the woods. "I swear I saw someone. They were just standing there." I insisted, my heart pounding. Avery rolled her eyes. "You're just seeing things. It's probably just a tree or something." But I wasn't so sure. The image of the figure lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, the flames flickering against the growing darkness. The whispers returned, creeping back into my thoughts, intertwining with the crackling fire. I tried to shake it off, laughing along with my friends, but the sense of dread only deepened. Then, as the firelight danced, I caught another glimpse of that dark figure at the edge of the trees, this time standing closer. It felt like it was watching us, waiting. I blinked, and just like that, it was gone again. "Did you guys see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" Jake replied, his brow furrowed. I hesitated, unsure how to explain. "I think there's something out there, something watching us." The laughter around the fire dimmed, and I could see the worry creep into their expressions. We tried to convince ourselves it was just our imagination, but deep down, we all knew something wasn't right. The night was thick with tension, every rustle of leaves amplifying the fear in my chest. We were gathered around the fire, but the warmth did little to comfort us. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting the shadowy figure to emerge again. The whispers had stopped, but that only heightened my unease. Suddenly, just as we were starting to relax, a loud crack echoed from the forest, like a branch snapping underfoot. My heart raced, and I could see the same panic reflected in my friend's eyes. Jake stood up, trying to act brave. "I'll go check it out," he said, though his voice wavered. "No way," I said, grabbing his arm. "We stick together. Whatever's out there, we don't need to find it." Avery nodded, looking over her shoulder at the darkness. "Maybe we should just pack up and leave. I don't like this." Just as we were about to agree, a low, guttural sound pierced the night air. It wasn't an animal, more like a warning growl that sent chills down my spine. I felt frozen in place as the noise came again, closer this time. "Let's get in the tent," I urged, but as we started to move, that shadow emerged from the trees. It was unmistakable, a figure, tall and dark, standing just outside the fire's reach. Panic gripped me. "Run!" I shouted, and without thinking, I grabbed my gear and bolted into the woods. I could hear my friends following close behind, their heavy footsteps pounding against the ground. We ran blindly, adrenaline fueling our flight as the figure seemed to follow us, always just out of sight, but never too far behind. The branches whipped at my face, and I stumbled more than once, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. "Where are we going?" Jake yelled, breathless, as we darted between trees. "I don't know, just keep running," I replied, glancing back, half expecting to see the figure catching up. The darkness felt alive, pressing in on us from all sides. As we broke through the underbrush, I spotted a clearing ahead. I pushed myself harder, desperate for the open space. We stumbled into the clearing, panting and wide-eyed, but the figure was still there, lingering at the edge of the trees, watching us. "Why isn't it coming after us?" Avery gasped, her voice trembling. "Maybe it's waiting for something," I said, my gut twisting with dread. Then, without warning, the figure stepped forward, its form becoming clearer in the dim light of the moon. My heart raced as I took in its unsettling appearance, tattered clothes and a face that was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its gaze piercing through the darkness. "Move!" Jake shouted, breaking my trance. We turned and ran again, heading back toward the camp. I didn't know if we'd make it back safely, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was pursuing us was toying with us, enjoying the chase. When we arrived at the campsite, we dismantled and put everything away as quickly as possible, and never camped in that area again. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping below the tree line. The place looked almost too good to be true, just like the photos on the Airbnb listing. A small, cozy wooden cabin tucked away in the woods, with nothing but trees in every direction. There wasn't another soul in sight. I remember stepping out of the car and standing there for a minute, just listening. It was quiet, really quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the soft hum of the wind. It felt a little eerie, but at the same time it was exactly what I'd been craving, a break from the constant noise of the city. I grabbed my bags and headed inside. The cabin was perfect, rustic but with all the modern comforts. The fireplace was set up and ready to go, and there was a handwritten note from the host on the kitchen table. "Welcome, Clara. Make yourself at home. If you need anything, I'm just down the road." The idea of having the host nearby was somewhat comforting, but honestly, I planned on staying completely alone for the weekend. That's why I came here, to get away from everyone. I spent the rest of the afternoon settling in, unpacking my stuff, and getting familiar with the place. I made a cup of tea and curled up on the couch with a book. The quiet was almost overwhelming at first, but after a while, I started to appreciate it. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could actually relax. As the sun went down, the cabin took on a different vibe. The windows turned into black mirrors, reflecting the inside of the cabin back at me, and the woods outside became a wall of darkness. I didn't think much of it at first, but there was this strange tension in the air. Every now and then, I'd hear a creak from the floorboards or the faintest rustle from outside. Probably just the cabin settling, or maybe some wildlife, I told myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the silence, it was the kind of silence that made me feel like I was being listened to. I tried to brush it off. It was my first night in an unfamiliar place, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. Still, when I climbed into bed, that unsettling feeling followed me. The cabin was warm, the bed was soft, but something about the pitch-black woods outside and the quiet that felt almost too heavy made it hard to relax. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see something or someone out there in the darkness. I told myself it was just nerves. It's weird being so far from anyone, but it was exactly what I'd wanted, right? I closed my eyes and tried to drift off, but the feeling stayed with me, creeping in the back of my mind. I wasn't completely alone out here. At least, it didn't feel that way. I woke up to the sound of footsteps, faint but distinct, like someone walking around just outside. At first, I tried to brush it off, thinking it was an animal, maybe a deer or something. But as I lay there in the dark, my heart pounding in my chest, I realized it wasn't that simple. These footsteps had a certain rhythm, a deliberate pace, like someone carefully circling the cabin. I froze, barely breathing, straining my ears to catch every sound. The footsteps stopped, right outside the front door. My pulse quickened, and I stared at the ceiling, hoping, praying that it was nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. The footsteps started again, this time moving toward the windows. I didn't dare get up, didn't even shift in bed. The sound of slow, steady crunching on the gravel outside moved to the side of the cabin, then to the back. Whoever, or whatever was out there, they were taking their time, like they were inspecting the place. I kept staring at the window, half expecting to see a shadow or a face peering in, but there was nothing. Just the sound of those footsteps pacing around in the dark. I glanced at my phone. No signal. Of course. After what felt like forever, the sound finally stopped. But even though the footsteps had faded, the tension in the air lingered. I lay there, wide awake, feeling that same unsettling sensation of being watched. It took a long time for my body to relax, but even then, I wasn't sure if the footsteps were gone for good. The next night, things only got worse. I was already on edge from the footsteps, but I tried to convince myself it was just the isolation getting to me. It's easy to spook yourself when you're alone, right? But that night, something new happened. Something I couldn't explain away so easily. It started with a soft tapping. At first, I thought it was the wind knocking a branch against the side of the cabin. But when I sat up in bed, listening more closely, it became clear it wasn't random. The taps came in steady intervals, 1, 2, 3, like someone was knocking gently on the window. I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to jump to conclusions. Maybe the wind had picked up, Maybe it was just a loose shutter. But the sound wasn't coming from the window in the bedroom. It was coming from the living room. I crept out of bed, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and moved slowly toward the living room. The tapping continued. Soft, deliberate. I stood there in the hallway, staring at the front window, waiting to see something. But all I saw was darkness. I moved closer, every instinct telling me to stop, but I couldn't. I had to know. When I was just a few feet from the window, the tapping stopped. Silence filled the room. I stood frozen, my heart in my throat, staring at the glass, waiting for something any to appear on the other side. But there was nothing, no movement, no shadows, just the faint reflection of my own pale face staring back at me. Then, just as I was about to back away, the tapping started again, this time at the window behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. The sound was louder now, more insistent, like whoever was out there wanted me to know they were watching. I bolted back to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I just sat there, listening, waiting, terrified of what might happen next. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay another night in that cabin. The tapping, the footsteps, it was all getting to be too much. I packed my things and got ready to leave, but of course, my car wouldn't start. I tried everything, checking the battery, the ignition, but it was dead. I was stranded. With no cell signal, I went back inside, trying to figure out my next move. As I wandered around the cabin, looking for anything I might have missed, I noticed something odd about the closet in the bedroom. The back wall didn't look right. The wood panels were slightly misaligned, like they had been moved or tampered with. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started feeling around. My fingers caught the edge of one of the panels, and with a small tug, the whole thing shifted. Behind it was a small door, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. It wasn't locked, so I opened it slowly, my stomach twisting with unease. Inside was a narrow, dusty staircase leading down into darkness. My first instinct was to close it up and pretend I hadn't seen it. But something about that hidden room pulled me in. Grabbing the flashlight from my bag, I carefully made my way down the creaky steps. The room below was small and cramped, the air thick with dust and dampness. At first it looked like a forgotten storage space, filled with old furniture and boxes. But then I noticed the photographs. Dozens of them, pinned to the walls, scattered across the floor. They were all of people. Different faces, different times, all taken from the same angle, through the trees, from a distance. That dark, smelly place full of pictures wasn't making me feel good. It was all too bizarre in there, so I left quickly. I stumbled back up the stairs, my head spinning, trying to make sense of it all. Whoever had been out there in the woods wasn't just watching. They had been watching everyone who had ever stayed in this cabin. After finding that room, I felt like I couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, and all I wanted was to get out of there. I grabbed my bag and ran out of the cabin, heading down the dirt path toward the host's house. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything over it. I kept looking back, half expecting someone or something to come out of the woods behind me. I was only halfway down the path when I saw him. A man, walking out of the trees, heading straight for the cabin. He wasn't in a hurry, just moving steadily like he knew exactly where he was going. He looked rough, disheveled clothes, unkempt hair, but it was his face that stopped me in my tracks. He wasn't surprised to see me. In fact, he didn't even seem to care. It was like I wasn't even there. His eyes were fixed on the cabin, and he just kept walking. Panic hit me full force, and I bolted the rest of the way down the path. My legs felt like jelly, but I didn't stop until I reached the Airbnb host's house. I pounded on the door, out of breath and shaking, trying to explain everything that had happened, the footsteps, the photographs, and the man I'd just seen. The host looked calm, too calm. He listened, nodding slowly as if I was telling him something he already knew. "Let's go check the cabin," he said, like it was no big deal. I didn't want to go back, but I followed him anyway. We walked the path in silence, the trees closing in around us. When we reached the cabin, it was quiet. No sign of the man, no sign of anything out of place. The host looked around, checked the porch, the windows, then shrugged like it was nothing. "No one here," he said, brushing it off. I felt like I was losing my mind. "But the room," I stammered. The hidden room in the closet, the photographs. He stared at me for a moment, then shook his head. There's no hidden room in that cabin. So, I get to this train station, middle of the night, dead tired from traveling, and the first thing I notice, it's practically abandoned. The whole place feels off. No movement, no voices, just these flickering overhead lights that barely light up the platform. The air feels stale, thick, like the station's been sitting here untouched for years. It's unsettling, but I try to shake it off. I sit down on this freezing cold metal bench, hoping to catch some rest before my train shows up, but it's too quiet. You know how some places are just too quiet? This is one of those places. The only thing I can hear is the steady drip of water somewhere in the distance, and it echoes through the empty station. I pull out my phone, instinctively checking for a signal. Of course, there's nothing. No bars, no Wi-Fi, not even a text message. It's like this place is cut off from the rest of the world. I glance around, trying to spot something familiar, something normal. There's this massive old clock on the wall, ticking so loud it feels like it's hammering in my head. Time's crawling. I swear, the minutes are dragging on forever. No announcements, no sign of life. It's like the station's just frozen in place, and I'm the only one left. After what feels like forever, I can't take just sitting anymore, so I get up and start wandering. Maybe there's someone I missed? A clerk? A janitor? Anybody? I head over to the ticket booth, but there's no one. The window's grimy, like it hasn't been cleaned in months, and the inside, completely empty. Just a faded chair pushed to the side, like whoever worked there up and left a long time ago. It's weird, but I figure, maybe it's just late. Small towns can get like that, right? I'm just about to head back to my bench when this sound comes over the PA system, loud and staticky. It's almost too loud in the silence. Then, this voice crackles through. The last train will arrive soon. All passengers, please board. Passengers? I haven't seen a single person here. Not one. My stomach drops a little, but I head back to the platform just to see what's going on. That's when I notice it. At the far end of the platform, a few shadowy figures just standing there, perfectly still, facing away from me. I head back to the platform, and that's when I see them. A few people, or at least I think they're people, standing at the far end of the platform. They're not moving, just facing away from me, almost like they're waiting for something. I don't know how I didn't notice them before. They're just there. But something about them feels wrong, like they're out of place. I'm still trying to make sense of it when the PA crackles again. Same voice, same garbled sound. The last train will arrive soon. All passengers, please board. The words echo in the empty station, but they don't move. No one does. It's like they're frozen in time, waiting for the train that might never come. I glance around, hoping maybe someone else will show up. But nothing. The figures at the end, they're still standing there, completely still, like they haven't even heard the announcement. Their clothes catch my eye. Something about them feels off, like they're wearing outfits from decades ago. Long coats, old-fashioned hats, the kind of thing you'd see in black and white photos. It's weird, unsettling. My gut's telling me to leave, but where am I gonna go? My train's coming, right? I check my phone again. Still no signal. Of course. The place feels like a dead zone, like it's disconnected from everything. I take a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Maybe this is just how things work in small towns like this. Maybe I'm overthinking it. But the longer I stand there, the more the tension builds. The clock above me ticks louder, almost like it's counting down to something. Each second feels heavier, more drawn out. The figures still haven't moved. I keep glancing at them, half expecting one of them to turn around, to do something. But they don't. They're just waiting. The PA crackles again, but this time it's just static. No words, just that harsh, buzzing noise filling the air. I step closer to the edge of the platform, peering down the tracks, hoping to see any sign of the train. Nothing. Just darkness stretching on and on. Finally, I hear it, a distant rumble growing louder, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. My heart races. The train is coming. As the sound gets closer, I can make out the shape of an old locomotive emerging from the darkness. It's rusted and battered, like it hasn't seen service in years. The headlights flicker weakly, cutting through the gloom. The train comes to a halt with a loud screeching sound. The doors open with a heavy creak, and I can feel an odd chill in the air. The shadowy figures at the end of the platform start to move, gliding toward the train without a word. I hesitate for a moment, feeling an instinctual urge to turn back, but there's nowhere else to go. So I step on board. Inside it's dark and cramped. The air is stale, filled with a musty smell that reminds me of old books and forgotten places. I find a seat and sit down, but I can't shake this nagging feeling that something's off. The other passengers are already seated, but they're eerily quiet. Their faces are obscured in shadow, and I can't make out any features. It's like they're not even there, just shells of people lost in their own world. I glance around, trying to get a read on them. There's an older man in a tattered coat, staring blankly out the window, and a woman with her head down, clutching a small bag in her lap. The silence in the train is thick, suffocating. I clear my throat, hoping to break the tension, but no one reacts. They don't even look my way. As the train lurches forward, I feel a pressure building in my chest. It's like the air has thickened, making it hard to breathe. I shift in my seat, trying to get comfortable, but the unease only grows. I look out the window, hoping to see something familiar, but all I can see is darkness, an endless void outside. I can't shake the feeling that the passengers are watching me, even though their eyes are hidden. I want to scream to get off this train, but I know I can't. I'm trapped here, stuck in this bizarre ride with these strange people who won't even acknowledge my presence. The train speeds up, and the pressure in my chest intensifies. I glance around the car, desperation setting in. I can't stay here. I need to find a way out. The doors seem locked, and no matter how hard I pull or shove, they won't budge. The panic starts to rise. I decide to make my way to the next car. Maybe I can find an exit or someone who can help. I push through the narrow aisle, trying to ignore the way the other passengers stare blankly ahead, their faces still shrouded in shadow. It's unsettling, like walking through a nightmare where everyone else is frozen in place. As I reach the next car, I try the door, but it won't open. I can hear the low hum of the train and the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks, but there's something else, a faint whispering that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I shake my head, trying to clear the fog of fear. I move to the back of the train and find another door. I grip the handle tightly and pull, but it feels like it's glued shut. Frustration builds inside me. I pound on the door, shouting for help, but my voice echoes back at me, swallowed by the dark. Suddenly, I hear a noise from behind me. I turn to see one of the shadowy passengers standing in the doorway of the car I just left. The dim light casts an eerie glow, revealing just enough to see the outline of their face, hollow and expressionless. I back away, instinctively moving toward the front of the train. My heart races as I push through more doors, feeling trapped with every step. I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, and the whispers grow louder, almost like they're calling me back. Finally, I find another door at the front of the train. I yank it open, and to my relief, it leads to the engine room. But it's just as dark and unsettling as the passenger cars. The conductor's seat is empty, and the controls are a mess of dials and levers that don't make any sense. With no other option, I look for a way out. I search for a window, anything to help me escape this nightmare. But all the windows and doors were locked, so I went back to my seat and sat there quietly. Hours went by until I saw a light through the window, and it was a station. When the train stopped, I quickly got out of it. I didn't know where I was, but anywhere was better than that train.